A change of coats now that it's flu season. October 25th, 2023. I should start off by saying that it's been a hot minute since I stopped writing about COVID and tyranny and started writing where that tyranny pushed the church. My focus as a writer has been and is the relationship that the church has with technology in general, but to not address what was one of the most iconic moments of my province during the last few years in relationship to where COVID pushed the church, well, that would just be cowardly. James Coates was acquitted of all charges of health order violations along with his church a few months ago. And all, not some, not, but we'll stick you with a big fine for the sake of the crown, some, all. And shortly thereafter, Tim Stevens had all his charges withdrawn by the court as well. These two pastors were held up by the media as objects of derision for churches that would simply comply and close their doors. And while I would love to get into the nitty-gritty of all things COVID mandates did to change our church and how we truly do church now, I would like to focus on one aspect, moving our churches online. These two pastors chose not to merely accept the baseless assumption of moving their church's services online as a valid activity in the face of the risks of COVID presented. In doing so, they both ran against the general grain of the church at large, which almost uniformly moved online in one capacity or another. Barna reports that 96% of churches moved online as early as 2020. But these two men stayed firmly within the 4% that remained, while the new field and market of online church service began to bloom and the government began to arrest pastors for exercising their charter rights. We saw what might be one of the biggest changes to the church liturgy or ecclesiology happen across almost every denominational background, that being the equivalency of online worship with in-person worship. The church at large decided that online worship was not only a possibility, but it was the right thing to do, and they did so in the face of a small minority of church leaders like Coates and Stevens that did not. This minority was painted as wrongdoers by the online church, and that online church was the obvious right thing to do given the circumstances. Those logging in and signing up for online church were being righteous, and what was happening at Grace Life and Fairview Baptist was just plain wrong. And we could be sure of them knowing it was wrong because of the federal law enforcement fitting nicely into a simplistic understanding of Romans 13, but more on that later. The issue we face is that the same government that declared them to be wrong found them to be acquitted of their wrongness and withdrew their charges. If these two pastors weren't the bad guys legally, if they weren't the law-breaking radicals the news and government painted them as, well then who were they? The problem with handing Romans 13 to a secularized government, like all of them we have up here in the True North Strong and Free-ish, is that if you don't teach them right, it's because they don't understand it right. They will end up twisting the scriptures to do wrong in the name of God. We simply cannot have freedom to exercise our religion that cannot be infringed upon or abridged or abrogated if 3 layers of fencing or a health order can do the impinging or abrogating. A health minister should have near total authority to do what's needed to be done during a pandemic response. But the charter is written to be a total authority within the measures put in place to make sure no one gets near it, and it got trampled on like the lawns of Grace Life as the fence went up. James and Tim clearly knew this when they took their stand and the health ministry did too. That's why there were measures to put in the Emergency Act as to grant universal amnesty to the health minister for actions done in good faith. Pastors who act on their good faith because they have good faith, well, they get to go to court. And while I'm happy for Fairview Baptist and Grace Life and the people I know that no longer attend my church that closed its doors but attend these churches that stayed open, we have a lingering issue to deal with at the church at large. You see, if the government loses a lawsuit like this, it isn't like some neutral party to that loss. Despite the assurances of the Emergency Act and what it gives to the plaintiff, if these pastors are now acquitted of all wrongs, then the plaintiff was wrong to arrest them, to jail them, and to most of all, it was likely wrong in the ways it told churches to worship in alternative ways, unlike these two churches. We were told by our government and our churches that we could simply, if not by concession, worship online, and that was the right thing to do in light of the wrong things being done over at Grace Life and Fairview Baptist. We Romans 13'd our way to live-stream at-home Eucharist, and these men spent a few months in jail, and we were told that we were doing things the right way, and that it was contrasted by trying our very best not to talk about what was being portrayed as the wrong way. I could rip into the individual communion servings, the ways we did weddings and funerals, and a host of other things, but I want to write about how the church went online, because prior to all this nonsense, we had every opportunity to move the church online without a government essentially telling us to do so. YouTube accounts are free, as are their reach and effectiveness. If the government told us to do something from a position of wrongness, it was to move our church online during the pandemic and an exercise of righteousness? Would you have made the changes to your church, I'm talking to you pastors, that you did, and how you look at the online service model, had you not been in a position of either causing a super spreader event or going to jail? Because the capacity to do so was freely available to the church for almost a decade or so prior to the pandemic. But you did make changes that had no theological backing, but only pragmatic ends. And those changes were lauded by a government now found in the wrong for insisting that those changes at Grace Life at the point of a gun. If you listen to that insisting on the right thing to do at your church, insisting on that particular interpretation of Romans 13, then any way you swing it now, you got that wrong. And the pastors that went against the grain and ended up in jail for it, turns out, were doing not only what they were allowed to do, but what they should have been doing. Does that not put us in the position of having done what we shouldn't have done at the church, in the church at large? Again, Barna reported 96% of pastors moved their churches online in some capacity in 2020, leaving a very narrow gate of 4% that either did nothing or did enough of something to catch the eye of authorities. 96% of pastors who historically don't agree on baptism, women in leadership, church membership, the end times, scriptural authority, wine in the Eucharist, and what to think about rainbow flags. And yet somehow all of them agreed that online church is valid and appropriate and a place to practice worship, even when it isn't a place. That needs to be brought back up for the kinds of questioning and cross-examination that pastors like Coates and Stevens are all too familiar with. The reasons we moved online are not just blind progress, and if you let blind progress and pragmatism get you online, now you have a reason to at least check your motivations. Because fear is the worst reason to do online church, and I fear that the only reason 96% were in favor of it right now, or at least it was. So take this to your next General Assembly or annual meeting or Bible study if need be. Do it in person and do it without a mask on and ask the church a few things. Why are we online? Why did we go online? And do 96% of us think we fit on the narrow path or not? Enter ye at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat, because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and there are few be that find it. Matthew 7:13-14, King James Version.